Belgrade, the summer of 1914. In the heat, thick with the smells of dust, scorched iron, and burned oil from the riverfront stalls, something strange began to stir. It wasn't smoke, though it moved like smoke after rain, dense, sweet, unnaturally tender. The scent did not come from the market, nor from gardens or merchant stalls. It rose from somewhere deeper, as if from the very bones of the city, seeping through the cracks in the cobblestone and turning the air into a slow, pink haze. It would not fade. On the contrary, the darker the sky grew, the wider it spread its invisible wings, filling streets and courtyards alike. By morning it settled upon skin and hair like a veil of fine dust. People could feel it on their fingertips even if they had never touched a flower. Everyone knew where that strange intoxication began. Knez Mihailova Street, choked with shops and cobblers' workshops, led straight to the corner where the old Kovacevic pharmacy stood. Its windows were boarded up, and above its door hung a rusty sign, weather-beaten green under the sun. Medicines, tinctures, remedies for all ailments. Once, life had flourished there. The place reeked of ether and camphor, and its shelves gleamed with rows of neatly labeled jars in Latin. Now it looked long dead. The window boards had cracked, the plaster was falling away, yet the sweetness, that fresh and tender scent, drifted precisely from beneath that very door. Neighbors whispered that the pharmacist had always been an odd man. Pavel Kovacevic, chemist, scholar, sometimes supplier to the royal court, had opened his own shop, selling medicines and rare essences. They said he understood scents the way poets understood words. He could separate purity from decay, distilling a single drop of beauty from a barrel of rot. He was known among the nobility for creating tonics, perfumes, and elixirs. But after the sudden death of his young wife, Milena, the apothecary withdrew from the world. He locked his doors, and at night neighbors swore they saw a pale blue glow around the roof, as though the flames of a spirit lamp still burned in the bowels of the cellar. Years passed, and Belgrade forgot him, until the scent returned, softly, insistently, as if waiting all along for the right moment. At first, it was only a whisper on the air, but soon people started noticing peculiar things. Withered rose petals appeared before the pharmacy's door, though no flowers grew nearby. At night, damp handprints pressed against the inner walls, long and slender, as if unseen fingers glided along the plaster from within. A guard's dog, trembling with terror, scratched at the ground and refused to pass the stairway leading to the shop. And once, on a boiling afternoon, two boys crept close and swore they saw a light flicker through the cracks of the boarded windows. Inside, a man in a white coat stood over a glass vial, stirring something slowly. Then he turned, saw them, perhaps, and vanished, leaving only a curl of smoke behind. The townsfolk took it as a bad omen. Belgrade was buzzing in those days, girding itself for war. Streets overflowed with rumors, but still, the city's officials found time to send an inspector to the abandoned building. He came slowly, reluctantly. Someone insisted the odor was harmless, just the residue of old medicinal oil, gone rancid over the years. Only one man disagreed, an aged grocer who lived across the street. He claimed that at night, he heard music, not bells, not footsteps, but a faint, trembling melody like breath echoing through glass vessels. When he leaned out to listen, the air itself seemed to hum, trembling like a pane of greenhouse glass. That was when the scent turned unbearable, so thick a person could nearly drown in it. Sometimes, when a shadow passed in the alley, someone would light a lantern, but the light never dispelled the fragrance. It seemed, under the glow of oil, to take shape. It rolled in invisible waves across the street, cooling by the pharmacy door, like a sigh, or the breath of someone standing just behind the wall, waiting for whoever would dare to come closer first. People told themselves it was the heat, nothing more. But even after the rain, When the dust was pressed flat to the streets, the scent did not weaken. In the rare, cold hours before dawn, when a draft from the Danube slipped between the buildings, it sharpened, acquiring a metallic tang, something between mercury and sugar. Rumors reached the city council. Priests came to bless the site and sprinkled holy water over the doorsteps. Yet, as soon as they left, a thin, oily trace began trickling down the wood again, glinting in the moonlight. The people realized that the scent could no longer be purged. It would not vanish, could not be driven out like smoke. It had become part of the street itself, its breath, its buried secret. Then came the heat wave, and the first thunder rolled over the roofs. Residents from further districts complained that the odor had spread, blanketing entire blocks. The wind carried it toward the waterfront, the market, the railway. That same day, a porter loading sacks of grain suddenly collapsed. When he awoke, white as plaster, he kept repeating the same thing, that he had seen a woman covered in roses staring at him with the eyes of the dead. After that, the pharmacy was sealed again. But the boards were black and brittle, and each spring a new crack appeared. From within those narrow crevices, a breath escaped, sweet, persistent, and deeply unsettling. People stopped walking down that street. Yet the wind, ignorant of human fear, still carried the fragrance across Belgrade for many more years. A ghostly perfume the city would never quite forget. Pavel Kovacevic was the kind of man one becomes only after stepping too close to the boundaries of time and death. Everyone in Belgrade knew him. Tall, thin, precisely dressed, his white coat always crisp, his face pale as paper, his hands rarely rising above his chest. It was said he could procure any powder, any poison, any miracle potion, if he saw curiosity or intellect in a person's eyes. He was respected at court, invited to hospitals and military infirmaries, and everything he touched smelled faintly of camphor, soap, and something troublingly sweet that seeped into walls and even stained paper. But everything changed the day Milena died. His wife, a young woman with dark, heavy hair and hands that always smelled of rose oil. After her death, the pharmacy was boarded shut. Kovacevic never stepped outside again, and no one ever saw him sell so much as a vial of medicine. They said Milena died of blood poisoning, a sudden, merciless inflammation that struck in midsummer, when the air was hot as molten wax. For 3 days Pavel never left her side, applying leeches, rubbing her body with mercury, changing her bandages again and again, until her breath simply stopped. After the funeral, he built a second floor above his shop, covering the windows with thick black curtains and wrapping every glass vessel in rags to block out the light. From that day on, every evening a suffocating silence descended over the Kovacevic house. No footsteps, no whispers, no scrape of chair or hinge. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the wind drifted from the Danube, people swore they heard breathing inside, quiet, deliberate, almost rhythmic, an inhale, then an exhale, like someone filling the air with a pink vapor. That vapor slipped outward, infecting the street with a sweetness that was both intoxicating and wrong. The neighbors were certain he had lost his mind. Once, some boys crept into his yard and found damp marks on the ground, as if someone had spilled a bucket of water, though it hadn't rained in weeks. One leaned closer and froze. There, pressed deep in the mud, were footprints, bare, feminine, delicate, but sunken so heavily they could not have been made by flesh, perhaps by something denser. That same night, the shop windows glowed faintly from within. People claimed shadows moved behind the curtains, a hunched figure of the pharmacist bending over a table, and another, a still shape, lying flat. By morning, the scent of roses had thickened until it clung to air itself, and the residents of Knez Mihailova Street stuffed rags under their window frames. As autumn approached, strange noises began to ripple from the house. Low tapping, wet pops like bubbles bursting under heat. Market women swore they saw trails of ash on the doorstep, and a seamstress living across the street claimed that some nights, near midnight, Kovacevic emerged onto his balcony to hang glass flasks filled with red liquid. He left them there under the full moon until dawn. People whispered that these bottles were later sold in secret for enormous sums, called the liquid of eternal sleep. No one knew what it contained. But after his death, several such flasks were discovered in the homes of the wealthy, each one sealed tight, and each one smelling of the same thing: roses and cold, the unmistakable stillness of a sealed tomb. The true horror began on a winter night, when a storm ripped a plank from the pharmacy window. By morning, a boy who had dared to look inside came stumbling home, his hair turned white. He remembered nothing clearly, only that the room held no furniture, no counters, only long garlands of withered flowers hanging from the ceiling, bone-dry yet heavy, and an air thick with the human scent of skin gone damp. When a city guard tried to force open the door, the lock crumbled beneath his hand, as if it had been burned hollow. From the keyhole pulsed warm air, like heat from a furnace. Soon they noticed that the walls had begun to sag inward, swelling in places like blistered skin, and even the bricks were coated in something sticky, brownish, translucent, like dried syrup. A widow from a nearby house swore that just before dawn, she saw smoke rising from the chimney. Inside that swirling gray veil moved the shadow of a woman in a white dress. She stood on the roof, facing the river, her hair wet and gleaming as if freshly dragged from the water. The widow crossed herself and murmured a prayer, but the smoke didn't clear. It only sank softly down to the street, seeping into the cobblestones until it left a faint dark imprint in the shape of a body. The next morning, from beneath the pharmacy's gates, oozed a clear fluid, black in sunlight yet aromatic like perfume, with the metallic tang of blood. The doors were boarded up again at night. A local healer, summoned by officials, refused to step inside. He merely said the house should be left alone, because what governs within it is no longer human. From then on, the pharmacy was a dead thing. But even through the trampled earth and gathering dust, one could feel that something still lived inside. In the evenings, the air at that end of the street thickened like fog, and if you pressed your ear to the wall, you could hear something faint, a slow, peaceful breath, like that of someone sleeping beneath a heavy pane of glass. No one doubted anymore that Kovacevic had sealed not only his past inside those walls, but death itself. And all that remained for the city was the lingering sweetness of roses, blended with ashes and fear, a scent that would haunt Belgrade forever. For years after his disappearance, the archives of the War Ministry still bore the name of Pavel Kovacevic, written in a neat, unwavering hand on reports that listed deliveries of formaldehyde, mercury, and pure ether for the army. The papers themselves smelled of sour iron and dust, and the ink refused to fade, as though the signatures had been pressed into the page rather than written upon it. Official documents described him as a dedicated pharmacist who assisted medical committees and embalmed fallen officers to give them a dignified appearance before burial. But the unofficial reports told a stranger tale. Informants whispered that Kovacevic locked himself in his laboratory for weeks at a time, working by the weak glow of a single lamp, discussing with unseen visitors methods of bodily preservation, so radical that no medical journal dared to print them. The autumn of that year hung over Belgrade like a sheet of dull metal. The city shrank beneath the shadow of coming war, and no one gave much attention to the faint smell of roses creeping back through the streets, like a ghost breathing somewhere below the earth. But it was then that the apothecary wrote his final notes, found years later on grease-stained parchment covered with cryptic markings, half erased, almost clawed away by a trembling hand. Between formulas and solution ratios lay words closer to incantations than science. Breath of skin, rose salt, wax of the heart. No scholar ever managed to decipher their meaning. Yet one truth was clear: Kovacevic was not merely trying to stop decay. He meant to revive the body's memory of life, even if only in part. By every account, his pharmacy had ceased to resemble a place of science and turned into something closer to a shrine. In the cellar, he had constructed a massive glass vessel the size of a coffin, into which he poured ether mixed with essences of rare oils and extracts of petals gathered from Damascus, Trieste, and Salonika. Those who dared peek through the windows claimed that pale dust often drifted from beneath the door, so fine it looked like smoke from the moon. Pavel worked in gloves, his hands trembling under the metal light, breathing chemicals until his skin cracked with tiny white fissures and his fingernails turned transparent, almost crystalline. They said he no longer ate or slept, surviving on bread soaked in ether and drinking water from apothecary vials. On the table before him always stood the same object, a thin lock of Milena's hair, coiled tightly within a narrow glass amulet. The watchman from the nearby church swore he once saw the apothecary light incense and place a copper bowl before the lamp, in which something faintly smoldered. He spoke words, Serbian words, perhaps, but twisted by a dry, foreign accent, as if repeating a dead language remembered only in fragments. Then he would snuff the lamp and stand motionless until the air in the room thickened like molten wax. After such nights, the scent outside would grow unbearably strong, sweet, choking, and sharp, like flowers mingled with a taste of iron. People began whispering that Kovacevic practiced dark alchemy. Some even claimed to see damp, rose-colored steam curling from his basement, carrying within it faint outlines of figures, sometimes a woman, sometimes a small child, sometimes shapeless entirely, trembling like reflections in disturbed water. When the authorities finally broke into the pharmacy, they found a wooden crate in the cellar filled with sealed vials and pages of notes. Each vessel bore a hand-drawn mark, uneven, the ink bleeding where an unsteady hand had shivered. Beneath these symbols were numbers, dates, and names. Soldiers, civilians, children, perhaps patients, perhaps something else. Among the records lay a single piece of paper that read, "Death is not the end, if chemistry can hold the breath." There were fingerprints pressed into the lid of the crate, as if it had been closed from the inside. The ink still looked fresh, though the apothecary had not been seen for years. One theory claimed that Powell did not experiment on corpses for science but for scent. He sought to turn the dead into vessels, perfect containers for fragrance, for what he believed was the one essence of life that never truly fades. The rose, he often said, does not die. It dissolves, giving itself entirely to the air. If a human body could be taught to breathe as a flower does, if blood could be replaced with ether, then the scent would endure long after flesh forgot it had once lived. They say it was after these attempts that the rose fragrance spread across the city, first subtle, then overwhelming, laying its invisible claim to every season, summer and winter alike. The last time anyone saw Pavel Kovacevic was at dawn, standing by the gates of St. Mark's Cemetery, carrying a glass vessel wrapped carefully in cloth. There was a calm joy on his face, the peace of a man who had accomplished what he most desired. A few days later, one of the shop's windows burst outward, glass warped as if sobbing, and the smell of roses changed. It grew bitter, laced with honey and blood. After that, Pavel was gone. His body was never found. But the air remained. It carried his secret like a stain that would not wash out. And all of Belgrade inhaled it, slowly, unconsciously, learning, perhaps, to breathe its own dead flowers. When the first artillery thundered over Belgrade, the city shrank like a living creature tightening against pain, and every street seemed stretched taut as a string. The authorities sought to use every building, every abandoned house. The old Kovacevic pharmacy, standing at the corner where the wind always smelled of ashes and roses, was listed as a potential depot for rations and medical supplies. No one remembered who the building had once belonged to. Those who did had long since been taken to the front. The place stood somber and overgrown with ivy, its windows sealed with gray cloth like the clouded eyes of a sick man. A city official, armed with a stamped order, commanded that the lock be broken and that the cellar be cleared. There was to be room made for sacks of flour and salt. It was the first time in many years that human feet crossed that threshold. The morning was windless, the air so thick it seemed to wobble. The work party included 4 young soldiers, tired, sunburned, rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. They descended the creaking stairs, laughing and mocking the superstitions whispered about the old shop. Their laughter faltered the moment one of them took his first breath below. The stench hit him like a blow. It wasn't rot, nor dampness, nor the spice of old medicines. The air was dense and syrupy, humid like vapor rising from boiling sugar, and it smelled painfully human. The scent of skin and sweat braided strangely with flowers. One soldier caught a droplet on his palm that had fallen from the ceiling. It was oily and warm. "Water's leaking," someone said, but the droplet reeked of ether and iron. They had barely managed to haul up a few boxes when a sound echoed from below, sharp and hollow, like metal clattering against stone. Then came a rasping noise from the depths, dry and muffled, neither groan nor sigh, but something that carried the tension of a breath drawn with effort and old fatigue. The first soldier bolted up the stairs, stumbling into the daylight, his helmet lost, his skin slick with sweat and patches of formalin. His eyes were void, the eyes of a new recruit forced into a morgue for the first time. The others did not return. Half an hour later, when an officer and a physician finally dared to go down, they found the remaining 3 frozen in grotesque positions, as if they had raised their arms to shield themselves from something standing directly before them. Their faces were white, glistening faintly, like porcelain masks. One man stood upright, back pressed to the wall. The second knelt as if praying. The third lay face down by the threshold, as though he had been crawling toward escape. The cellar floor was strewn with rose petals, brittle and dried yet still exhaling a dizzying scent. A draft rocked the oil lamp, and in its flickering glow the walls seemed to shine, not with moisture, but coated in something glossy, like varnish. From the ceiling hung wire hooks, each supporting a glass vessel shaped like a grave candle. Inside them, a thick liquid swayed, and within that liquid, too faint to see at first, something moved, like breath trapped in substance. On the work table stood a tin-covered box, its lid slightly ajar. Within were figures, life-sized and eerily human, molded as if from wax. But they were not wax. The doctor confirmed their skin was real, bloodless, bleached, preserved in some formula no one could name. The bodies were cold, yet their flesh was soft to the touch. Later, a few soldiers swore that one of those figures had shifted, just barely, as though brushed by a passing breeze. The investigation was brief. Officers ordered the building sealed, forbidding anyone to return. One of the surviving soldiers died of fever within a week. Another fled to the front as a volunteer and, according to rumor, was later found shooting at his own shadow, convinced that the smell of roses followed him every morning. In his report, the army doctor recorded a disturbing detail. A faint, wax-like film had appeared on the skin of all 3 men who perished in the cellar. Their bodies exuded the same floral fragrance, as if they had breathed that subterranean air too long, the air saturated with formaldehyde and ether. The next day, the cellar was bricked shut. Officials announced that the soldiers had suffocated from chemical fumes. But the townspeople knew better. Death, they said, had smelled like flowers, and the flowers like death. Weeks later, a new rumor spread through Belgrade. At night, people claimed, a slow human sigh rose from beneath the ground, long and soft, like the breath of someone freed from a mask. Once more, the city filled with that same fragrance, elusive, seductive, suffocating. Residents shut their windows, but the scent seeped through stone and mortar, as if searching for lungs to fill. And from then on, anyone who passed the abandoned pharmacy could sense it. The faint, quivering stir of air around their ankles, as though something unseen below was still breathing, quietly exhaling from under their feet. The investigation was brief, almost rushed, as if the city itself were desperate to forget what had been found. The soldiers called to assist averted their eyes, while the doctors descending into the cellar covered their faces with vinegar-soaked cloth, hoping to keep the stench at bay. But vinegar did nothing. The air down there was thick as syrup, and it reeked not of death, but of something deceptively alive, a sweetness that clung to the throat. It was the scent of roses, warm and damp, like the perfume of a freshly cut blossom pressed against skin. The lamps sputtered, their dim light floating across the walls, and sliding over the rows of bodies laid out in careful order. The first doctor who approached one stepped back almost immediately, unable to continue. The bodies weren't decomposing. Their flesh was cool as porcelain, and when touched, the skin flexed faintly beneath the fingers, as though it still remembered how to breathe. Each corpse was coated in a clear, viscous substance that made the skin shine tautly. On the chest of every one lay a rose, crafted from paper and wax, yet soft to the touch and perfumed with that now familiar scent. The bodies were arranged in layers, spiraled like the petals of a flower folding inward. In the corners stood jars containing the remnants of some liquid. The labels were mostly smudged, save for one where a single word could still be read: formal. Beneath the shelves were scattered instruments, spatulas, bloodied bandages, clumps of hair, and pages covered in erratic handwriting marked formulas vitae. The ink was shaky, the script uneven, as though written by someone overcome with exhaustion or obsession. There was something unnervingly similar about all the faces. That same subtle curve of the lips, the identical outline of the jaw. Even the length of their eyelashes matched, as though a single face had been reproduced again and again with barely perceptible variations, like a series of flawed casts molded by an artist too haunted to stop. It seemed clear that the apothecary had been copying someone, unable to release either her image or her scent. The doctors noted that the bodies belonged to people of various ages. Some bore healed scars, others signs of illness, and a few appeared so young they seemed carved from wax. Yet all of them, without exception, carried the same expression, a stillness heavy with intention, as if behind the skin lay something sentient, resting, waiting. Dr. Kovacevic, who led the examination, later confessed in his report that he had the eerie impression the bodies were not lying still but waiting, as though their existence had been paused mid-breath, suspended, not extinguished. He noted that the muscles retained elasticity, the eyes had not clouded, and some pupils caught the flicker of the lamps, reflecting light like the glass eyes of a doll. When the doctors attempted to carry one of the bodies to the surface, the soldiers handling it found their arms erupting in rashes, the skin singed as if by heat. On their boots, a fine powder clung, reddish, like crushed petals. The officers, upon reading the report, ordered everything destroyed. But the fire set that night failed. Flames devoured the plaster, blackened the ceiling, but the bodies would not burn. Instead, their skin began to exude a clear moisture that slid down their limbs like tears, and when the fire finally died, from the ashes rose that same scent once more, richer, heavier, undeniable. Eyewitnesses swore that the smoke drifting from the house was not black but rose-colored, and within it flickered human silhouettes. By morning, a layer of ash covered the street outside. It glimmered under the sunrise like powdered sugar, and those who dared to taste it later described a sweetness that made them shudder. A few days later, an officer came to confirm the destruction was complete. He descended the cooled staircase and found, between the charred floorboards, a human hand. It looked alive, the fingers etched with lines, the nails translucent. Beneath one, so witnesses claimed, there was blood. When the officer touched it, the hand moved, softly, almost curiously, like something waking from sleep. On its chest lay a rose, still fresh, as if placed there only yesterday. That discovery was the last. The remaining notes were confiscated, the building bricked over, and every participant in the case reassigned to the front lines. Belgrade worked hard to erase the memory of the pharmacy and its dead flowers. But the fragrance endured. At night it drifted through the streets, seeping through window cracks, reminding everyone that roses, once awakened from the dead, do not wither again. And no one in Belgrade could ever be entirely sure that the ground beneath their feet was truly earth, and not the roof of a vast, eternal cellar, where fragrance had become breath, and the flowers below were still learning to breathe. They burned down Kovacevic's house quickly, the way one burns quarantine barracks, without ceremony, only relief. The city had grown weary of the talk, the gawkers, the pilgrims who came and went, and most of all, of that sweet, clinging perfume that even smoke could not erase. When the fire reached the upper beams, the flames turned pink, and the smoke no longer gray but transparent, almost luminous, as though the air itself refused to conceal what was happening. The wind carried it upward through the narrow streets toward the river, and those who had shuttered their windows swore they could feel something spreading through the city along with that smoke. A memory, a fragrance, a breath. When the fire died, only a perfect black rectangle of scorched earth remained, still silent, utterly bare. By spring, not a blade of grass had grown there. The soil stayed smooth and dry as glass. Years passed. Belgrade endured bombardment, famine, occupation, the kind of suffering that erases old fears. A new generation came, one that no longer remembered the apothecary's name. Children played amid the ruins, rolling charred bricks across the dust, while the old men who watched them from benches would wince whenever the wind brought a faint, almost pleasant sweetness, something achingly familiar. Locals said that at sunset, the ground at that spot gleamed faintly pink, and sometimes at dawn a thin veil of steam rose from the soil, like the ghost of breath. There were those who claimed that on moonless nights a faint light appeared there, glimmering like an oil lamp drowned in honey. Then one spring, years after the war, as flowers and people began returning to the streets, the wind once again carried the scent of roses. It wasn't strong, light, almost hesitant, but so unmistakable it sent chills through those who caught it. The sky that evening was starless, and it seemed that the scent came not from the earth at all, but from above, falling like a rain of aromatic mist. That was when the old men began whispering that the apothecary's soul had returned, that he was checking to see whether his fragrance had survived, whether some fragment of his gift still lingered in the air. People spoke his name again, this time without fear, softly, with a kind of mournful caution, the way one speaks of an old wound that has long stopped bleeding, though it still aches in the rain. Some time later, a schoolteacher researching pre-war Belgrade came across an old, yellowed newspaper in the archives. On the last page, among ads for soap and boarding houses, he found a small notice printed in ornate lettering. Kovacevic Pharmacy. Elixir of longevity, granting bodies eternal freshness. The paper smelled of roses. Not of age, dust, or ink, of roses. The scent was faint but real, and though the newspaper was more than 20 years old, the fragrance seemed untouched by time. Some letters had faded, but the text was still legible. The teacher closed the page, yet the aroma clung to his hands, to his clothes. Walking home, he swore it followed him through the streets. That night he slept poorly, tossing until dawn, waking with a headache and a strange sweetness on his tongue, as if a tiny rose had bloomed somewhere behind it. Soon, other relics began to surface. In the library, archivists discovered an old apothecary bottle bearing the imprint of a hand, its shape frozen in the glass as though skin and air had traded places. At the museum, a staff member unfolded a brittle advertisement for essential oils, and the room filled instantly with the scent of fresh flowers, as if the paper itself were breathing. Scientists tried to explain the phenomenon through chemical residues in the ink, but none succeeded in reproducing the aroma. Even soil samples taken from the pharmacy's site offered no clue. Laboratories reported that the material was inorganic, lifeless. And yet, whenever a vial was unsealed, a faint, almost tender sweetness wafted through the air. At night, residents of the surrounding homes claimed to see a shape moving along the empty street, a shadow in a long white coat. It glided slowly, never touching the ground, fading when it reached the corner. Those who dared approach spoke of how the air suddenly grew heavy and moist, how breathing became difficult, and yet the heart began to hammer in the chest, as if the body itself remembered its own scent. In the mornings, palm prints sometimes appeared on nearby shop windows, as though someone had leaned against the glass from the other side. The elders insisted it was no ghost at all, but the air itself, air that had absorbed a man. They said Kovacevic's perfume was not merely a fragrance, but a form of existence, his breath, dispersed and eternal. Others believed that everyone who had once inhaled that scent carried it still, woven into their blood. They spoke of an autumn illness that swept the neighborhood, strange, almost pleasant. People grew drowsy. Their skin gleamed faintly, and even the elderly took on a soft rose hue in their cheeks. Doctors found nothing wrong. Yet someone wrote in a private journal that the townsfolk's dreams had changed. They were filled with gardens, laughter, women's voices, and the endless murmur of bees. It was paradise, but not of this earth. One early spring, when the river overflowed and fog blanketed the city, something extraordinary appeared on the scorched lot where the pharmacy had stood. A sprout, pale, nearly translucent, white rather than green. Within a week it unfurled into a small rosebush. Its petals gave off the scent of ether and honey. Its stem smelled of alcohol and antiseptic. People were afraid to touch it. They stood in silence, watching the branches tremble gently under the wind, and each person swore the air around them grew lighter, purer. But when evening came and the sun set, the bush vanished. The next morning, nothing remained, nothing but the scent. That same scent. Belgrade never saw such a miracle again. Yet every spring, especially after the rain, the old streets still breathed faintly of sweetness, cloying, seductive, and sad. And when travelers ask why flowers here seem to smell heavier, richer, more intoxicating than anywhere else, the elders only smile their tired smile and answer, "Perhaps it's just the wind, checking whether the trace of Kovacevic is still here. The apothecary who outwitted death by mixing it with the rose-colored scent of life."